The explosion that should have killed Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez instead threw her 200 meters into a ravine where she lay broken and bleeding as her convoy burned above her, officially listed as Kie while enemy forces closed in from all sides. What happened next would become the longest solo escape and evasion mission in modern military history, as a combat medic with 2 shattered legs and no equipment would spend 47 days walking 300 miles through hostile territory to reach friendly lines. The morning had started like any other patrol in the Kandahar province of Afghanistan. Elena checked her medical kit for the 3rd time, ensuring every bandage, morphine syringe, and surgical instrument was exactly where it should be. As the lead medic for Bravo Company's 2nd platoon, she developed a reputation for being obsessively prepared, a trait that had saved more lives than anyone cared to count during their 8-month deployment. The convoy of 4 armored vehicles rolled out of Forward Operating Base Martinez at 0600, their mission to deliver medical supplies to a remote outpost that had been reporting casualties from increased Taliban activity. Elena rode in the 2nd vehicle, her aid bag secured beside her, watching the barren landscape roll past through the small bulletproof window. The terrain was unforgiving, all rocky hills and deep ravines that provided perfect cover for insurgents. With RPGs and improvised explosive devices, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, the convoy commander, had briefed them on the route the night before. The road they'd be taking was considered relatively secure, having been cleared by EOD teams just 48 hours earlier. Intelligence reports suggested minimal enemy activity in the area, though Elena had learned to take such assessments with considerable skepticism. In her experience, the Taliban had an uncomfortable habit of appearing exactly where they weren't supposed to be. The convoy had been moving for 2 hours when Rodriguez's voice crackled through the radio with the kind of casual urgency that experienced soldiers recognize as a precursor to violence. All vehicles, we've got movement on the ridgeline to our east. Possible hostile observation posts. Maintain spacing and be ready to respond to contact. Elena instinctively checked her rifle and adjusted her body armor, though as a medic she was more concerned about the potential for casualties than engaging the enemy directly. Her job was to keep people alive, not to kill them, though she was proficient enough with her M4 carbine to defend herself and her patients when necessary. The attack came without warning, as they always did. One moment the convoy was navigating a narrow stretch of road between 2 rocky hills. The next moment the world exploded into chaos. The lead vehicle disappeared in a massive fireball as a buried IED detonated directly beneath it, sending chunks of armored steel spinning through the air like deadly confetti. Before Elena could even process what was happening, RPGs began streaking down from the ridgelines on both sides of the road. I'd, lead vehicle is down. Rodriguez's voice was strained but controlled as he tried to coordinate a response to the ambush. All vehicles, move to contact. Get us out of the kill zone. Elena's vehicle lurched forward as the driver attempted to accelerate past the burning wreckage of the lead truck, but they'd traveled less than 50 meters when the second IED detonated. This one was positioned perfectly to catch vehicles trying to escape the initial blast, and the explosion lifted their 20-ton MRAP completely off the ground. Subscribe now and become part of our amazing community. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video. Time seemed to slow as Elena found herself weightless, watching her medical equipment float around the vehicle's interior like some grotesque snow globe. She could see Rodriguez in the front seat, his mouth open in a scream she couldn't hear. Over the ringing in her ears, the vehicle rotated lazily through the air, and through the shattered windshield, she caught a glimpse of the rocky ravine they were falling toward. The impact was surprisingly gentle, almost anticlimactic after the violence of the explosion. Elena's body armor absorbed some of the shock, but she felt something fundamental break in her left leg as the vehicle rolled down the steep embankment. The world spun around her in a kaleidoscope of sky, rock, and twisted metal until the MRAP finally came to rest on its side against a boulder. Silence followed, broken only by the hiss of escaping steam and the distant sound of automatic weapons fire from the road above. Elena tried to move and immediately regretted it as pain shot through her leg like an electric current. Her left femur was clearly broken, possibly in multiple places, and her right ankle was twisted at an angle that suggested significant damage to the joint. "Rodriguez," she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. "Rodriguez, you okay?" No response. Elena managed to turn her head enough to see the convoy commander slumped over the steering wheel, blood pooling beneath his head. The driver was clearly dead, his neck bent at an impossible angle. In the back of the vehicle, Corporal Morrison was unconscious but breathing, though a piece of shrapnel had opened a nasty gash across his forehead. Elena's medical training kicked in despite her own injuries. She needed to assess the situation, treat the wounded, and establish communications with higher headquarters. But first, she needed to determine whether they were in immediate danger from enemy forces. The sound of voices speaking in Pashto from somewhere above the ravine answered that question. The Taliban fighters were moving down from their positions to investigate the wreckage, and Elena could hear them getting closer. She fumbled for her radio, but the device had been destroyed. In the crash, its antenna snapped off and its case cracked open, working through pain that made her vision blur. Elena managed to extract her sidearm and check that it was loaded and functional. 9 rounds in the magazine, 1 in the chamber. Not much against what sounded like a dozen or more fighters, but it was better than nothing. She also retrieved her aid bag, which had somehow survived the crash intact. The voices were getting closer now, and Elena could hear the distinctive sound of equipment being moved around up on the road. The Taliban fighters were probably looting the destroyed vehicles and searching for survivors. She had maybe 5 minutes before they discovered the MRAP in the ravine. Elena made a decision that would save her life and define everything that came after. Instead of staying with the vehicle and attempting to defend Morrison and Rodriguez's body, she gathered her medical supplies and began crawling deeper into the ravine. Her broken leg dragged behind her, sending waves of agony through her body with every movement. But she forced herself to keep going. The ravine was deeper than it had appeared from the road, with numerous side channels and rocky overhangs that provided potential concealment. Elena found a spot about 100 meters from the crash site where a fallen boulder created a small cave-like depression. She pulled herself into the hiding spot just as the first Taliban fighters reached the MRAP. From her concealed position, Elena watched as 6 men in traditional Afghan dress examined the wreckage. They were armed with AK-47s and moved with the casual confidence of fighters who knew they controlled the battlefield. One of them climbed into the overturned vehicle and emerged a moment later, dragging Morrison's unconscious form. What happened next was something Elena would never forget and never fully forgive herself for. The Taliban fighters executed Morrison with a single shot to the head, then did the same to Rodriguez's body. They stripped the dead soldiers of their equipment and weapons, then set fire to the MRAP with a white phosphorus grenade that burned with an intensity that made Elena's eyes water even from her distant hiding spot. The fighters spent another 20 minutes searching the immediate area, coming within 10 meters of Elena's hiding place at one point. She held her breath and pressed herself deeper into the rocky depression, her hand gripping her pistol so tightly her knuckles went white. But the Taliban fighters were focused on the road and the other vehicles in the convoy, not on the possibility that someone might have survived the crash and crawled away. When they finally moved on, Elena was alone in the ravine with 2 broken legs, minimal supplies, and no way to contact friendly forces. The sound of gunfire from the road had stopped, suggesting that the ambush was over and the Taliban fighters had either killed or captured the rest of the convoy. She was officially dead, listed as Kier, along with the rest of her unit. The reality of her situation began to settle in as the adrenaline from the attack wore off. She was deep in enemy territory, injured, and without communications. The nearest friendly forces were at FOB Martinez, roughly 300 miles to the southeast. Between her and safety lay some of the most dangerous terrain in Afghanistan, controlled by Taliban forces who would kill her without hesitation if they discovered her. Elena opened her medical bag and began assessing her injuries with the clinical detachment she'd learned to apply when treating wounded soldiers. The left femur was definitely broken, probably a compound fracture based on the way the bone was pressing against her skin. The right ankle was severely sprained and possibly fractured. She had numerous cuts and bruises from the crash, but nothing that appeared life-threatening. Using materials from her medical kit, Elena splinted her broken leg as best she could and wrapped her ankle in elastic bandage. The pain was excruciating, but she'd learned to compartmentalize physical discomfort during her medical training. Pain was just information, and right now she needed to focus on survival, not comfort. As darkness fell over the ravine, Elena began planning her escape. She had enough medical supplies to last maybe 2 weeks if she was careful, and enough water for 3 days. Food was limited to a few energy bars and MREs she'd been carrying. The terrain between her position and friendly lines was mountainous and difficult even for healthy soldiers, let alone someone with 2 broken legs. But Elena had advantages the Taliban fighters didn't know about. As a combat medic, she'd been trained in survival techniques and had extensive knowledge of field medicine. She also had something more valuable than equipment or supplies: the absolute determination to make it home alive. The sound of helicopters in the distance made her heart race with hope for a moment before reality set in. The aircraft were too far away to signal, and even if she could get their attention, the Taliban fighters were still in the area. Any rescue attempt would likely result in more casualties, and Elena wasn't willing to risk other lives for her own. She would have to walk home. Elena had dreamed of being a soldier since she was 12 years old, watching her older brother Marcus return from his deployment in Iraq with stories that mixed horror and heroism in equal measure. But when she walked into the Army recruitment office in El Paso, Texas, the sergeant behind the desk took one look at her 5'2" frame and suggested she might be better suited for administrative work or perhaps the motor pool, combat medic. Elena had said firmly, ignoring the condescending smile, "I want to save lives on the front lines." The recruiter, a weathered staff sergeant named Williams, had leaned back in his chair and studied her with the kind of expression reserved for overly ambitious teenagers. "Look, miss, being a medic isn't like what you see in the movies. You're talking about carrying wounded soldiers who weigh twice what you do, working under fire, making life and death decisions when everyone around you is screaming. Maybe you should consider something more suitable." Elena had stared at him for a long moment, then pulled out her MT certification and her acceptance letter to nursing school. "I've been working emergency rooms since I was 18. I've performed CPR on gunshot victims, helped deliver babies in the back of ambulances, and held pressure on wounds while surgeons worked to save lives. I'm not here because I watched a movie. I'm here because I know what I'm good at." Williams had grudgingly processed her paperwork, but Elena could see the doubt in his eyes. It was a look she'd grown accustomed to throughout her childhood in a working-class neighborhood, where being small and female meant you were expected to be quiet and stay out of the way. Her father, a construction worker who'd immigrated from Mexico, had always encouraged her academic pursuits, but worried about her decision to join the military. "Mia," he'd said the night before she left for basic training, "you don't have to prove anything to anyone. You could be a nurse, work in a hospital, help people without putting yourself in danger." Elena had hugged him tightly, breathing in the familiar scent of sawdust and aftershave that she associated with safety and home. "Papa, I need to do this. There are soldiers out there who need someone who won't give up on them, who'll fight as hard to save their life as they fought to serve their country." Basic training at Fort Sam Houston had been a revelation. Elena discovered that her small stature was actually an advantage in many situations, allowing her to move through tight spaces and requiring less food and water than her larger counterparts. More importantly, she found that her years of working in emergency medicine had given her something many of her fellow trainees lacked: the ability to remain calm under pressure. The physical training was brutal, designed to weed out anyone who couldn't handle the demands of military life. Elena struggled with some of the strength requirements, but she made up for it with endurance and determination. While other recruits complained about early morning runs and endless push-ups, Elena pushed herself harder, staying after hours to practice combat drills and memorize medical procedures. Her drill instructor, Sergeant First Class Martinez, had initially been skeptical of Elena's chances. "Vasquez," he'd said during the second week of training, "you're tough, I'll give you that. But being tough isn't enough when you're trying to drag a 200-pound soldier out of a firefight. You need to be strong, and you need to be fast." Elena had taken the criticism seriously, spending every free moment in the gym and practicing casualty evacuation drills. She learned to use leverage and technique to move patients much larger than herself, and she developed a reputation for being willing to attempt procedures that other medics considered too risky. Advanced individual training for combat medics was where Elena truly found her calling. The course was intense, combining medical training with combat skills in a way that prepared students for the reality of treating wounded soldiers under fire. Elena excelled at the medical aspects, her prior experience giving her an edge in understanding anatomy, pharmacology, and emergency procedures, but it was during the combat training that Elena truly distinguished herself. While other students focused on the technical aspects of treating wounds, Elena seemed to understand intuitively how to prioritize multiple casualties, how to work efficiently under stress, and how to make the kind of split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death. Her instructors began to notice her exceptional performance during scenario-based training exercises. During one particularly challenging simulation, Elena had to treat 4 casualties simultaneously while under simulated enemy fire. She had triaged the wounded, stabilized the most critical patients, and coordinated their evacuation in record time. Vasquez, her instructor, a combat veteran named Sergeant Davies, had said after the exercise, "That was textbook work. You've got instincts that can't be taught. But you need to understand something about being a medic in combat. You're going to see things that will stay with you forever. You're going to lose patience despite your best efforts. Are you prepared for that?" Elena had nodded, though she wouldn't truly understand what he meant until months later, when she was kneeling beside a dying soldier in a dusty compound in Afghanistan, holding his hand as he asked her to tell his mother he loved her. Her first deployment came 8 months after completing her training. Elena was assigned to Bravo Company, 2nd Battalion, 187th Infantry Regiment, a unit with a reputation for aggressive tactics and high casualty rates. The company was scheduled to deploy to Afghanistan's Kandahar province, one of the most dangerous areas in the country. The pre-deployment briefings painted a picture of a complex and dangerous environment, where American forces were attempting to establish security while Taliban insurgents used guerrilla tactics to maintain control over rural areas. Elena studied intelligence reports and medical statistics with the same intensity she'd once applied to her college textbooks. "The injury patterns you'll see are different from what you trained for," explained Captain Morrison, the company's senior medic, during a briefing at Fort Campbell. "IEDs cause traumatic amputations, internal bleeding, and blast injuries that are difficult to treat in the field. Gunshot wounds are often from high-velocity rounds that create massive tissue damage. You'll be working with limited supplies in less than ideal conditions. Elena had volunteered for every additional training opportunity, learning to perform emergency surgery in field conditions, studying the latest techniques for treating blast injuries, and practicing with new equipment designed for forward deployed medics. She understood that her effectiveness as a combat medic would directly impact the survival rates of the soldiers she'd be serving with. The night before deployment, Elena had called her father from the base. "I'm ready, Papa," she'd said though. She could hear the uncertainty in her own voice. "I've trained for this, and I know I can make a difference." "I know you can, Mia," he'd replied, his voice thick with emotion. "But promise me you'll be careful. Promise me you'll come home." Elena had promised, though she understood even then that it was a promise she might not be able to keep. Combat medics had one of the highest casualty rates in the military, precisely because their job required them to expose themselves to danger in order to treat wounded soldiers. Her first month in Afghanistan had been a series of patrols and medical calls that gradually acclimated her to the reality of combat operations. Elena treated everything from minor injuries to serious wounds, learning to work efficiently in the back of moving vehicles and in compounds where sniper fire was a constant threat. The soldiers in her unit initially viewed her with the same skepticism she'd encountered throughout her military career. Elena was not only small and female, but she was also new to combat operations. Some of the more experienced soldiers questioned whether she'd be able to handle the physical and emotional demands of treating casualties under fire. Elena had proven herself during her third week in country when their patrol had been ambushed near a village outside Kandahar. Private Johnson, a machine gunner, had been hit in the shoulder by rifle fire and was bleeding heavily. Elena had crawled across 30 meters of open ground under fire to reach him, applied a tourniquet to stop the bleeding, and then helped carry him to safety. "Doc," Johnson had said as Elena worked on his wound, "I thought you were too small to be a real medic." I was wrong. Word of Elena's actions spread quickly through the company, and she began to earn the respect of soldiers who had initially doubted her capabilities. She developed a reputation for being willing to take risks to save lives, for staying calm under pressure, and for never giving up on a patient, no matter how severe their injuries. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, the platoon's senior NCO, had pulled Elena aside after the Johnson incident. "Vasquez, you've got the skills and the courage to be an outstanding medic. But you need to understand something about survival in combat. Sometimes the best thing you can do for your patients is to keep yourself alive. Dead medics don't save lives." Elena had appreciated the advice, though she struggled with the balance between personal safety and her duty to treat wounded soldiers. Her medical training had emphasized the principle of first, do no harm, but combat medicine required a different calculus where acceptable risk was weighed against potential benefit. Over the following months, Elena had treated dozens of casualties, ranging from minor cuts and bruises to life-threatening injuries. She'd performed emergency surgery in the back of moving vehicles, treated patients while under enemy fire, and made the kind of difficult decisions that would have been unthinkable in civilian medicine. Each case had taught her something new about combat medicine and about her own capabilities. Elena discovered that she had an intuitive understanding of how to prioritize multiple casualties, how to work efficiently with limited supplies, and how to maintain her composure when everything around her was chaos. The soldiers in her unit began to seek her out not just for medical treatment, but for advice and conversation. Elena had a way of listening that made people feel heard, and her presence had a calming effect that was particularly valuable in the high-stress environment of combat operations. "Doc," Private Williams had said one evening as Elena checked his infected foot, "you're different from the other medics we've had. You actually seem to care about us as people, not just as patients." Elena had smiled at the compliment, though she knew that caring too much about her patients could be emotionally dangerous. Every soldier she treated was someone's son or daughter, someone who had people at home waiting for them to return safely. The weight of that responsibility was something she carried with her every day. Her reputation for exceptional performance had caught the attention of higher-level commanders, and Elena had been recommended for advanced training in trauma surgery and combat medicine. She declined the opportunity, preferring to stay with her unit rather than advance her career at their expense. "I'm not here to climb the ladder," she'd explained to Captain Morrison when he'd encouraged her to accept the training assignment. "I'm here to keep these soldiers alive. That's my job, and it's what I'm good at." The morning of the convoy ambush, Elena had been just another soldier doing her job, unaware that she was about to face a test that would challenge everything she'd learned about survival, medicine, and her own capabilities. The explosion that had thrown her into the ravine had also thrown her into a situation where all her training and experience would be tested in ways she'd never imagined. As she lay in the darkness of the ravine, listening to the distant sounds of the Taliban fighters moving around the wreckage, Elena reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. Every challenge she'd faced, every person who doubted her abilities, every patient she'd treated had been preparation for what lay ahead. She would need every skill she'd learned, every lesson she'd absorbed, and every ounce of determination she possessed to survive what was coming. The girl who'd walked into the recruitment office in El Paso had become a soldier who refused to accept limitations imposed by others. Now she would discover what she was truly capable of when stripped of everything except her training, her willpower, and her absolute determination to make it home alive. The helicopter that found Elena 3 days after the ambush wasn't supposed to be there. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chun had been flying search and rescue missions in Afghanistan for 2 years, and she'd learned to read the subtle signs that distinguished a routine recovery from something extraordinary. The way the surviving convoy member's voice had cracked when he described seeing Doc Vasquez thrown into the ravine. The fact that no body had been recovered, and the unusual amount of Taliban activity in the area all suggested that this wasn't a standard casualty collection. Chun had built her reputation on finding people others had written off as lost. As one of the few female pilots qualified to fly the HH-60 Pave Hawk in combat operations, she'd faced the same skepticism and barriers that plagued women throughout the military. But where others saw obstacles, Chun saw opportunities to prove that gender had nothing to do with competence under pressure. The morning she received the mission brief about the convoy ambush, Chun was already planning her third search pattern for the area. Official reports listed all convoy members as Kia, but something about the casualty reports didn't add up. The body count was wrong, and the Taliban fighters who'd been captured during a separate operation had made references to the one who got away that intelligence officers had dismissed as psychological warfare. Chun's co-pilot, Captain James Morrison, had questioned her decision to conduct another search in an area that had already been cleared by ground forces. "Ma'am, we've been over that grid square 4 times. If someone was down there, we would have found them by now. The Taliban have been all over that area for days." Chun had studied the terrain maps with the obsessive attention to detail that had made her one of the most effective search and rescue pilots in the theater. The ravine system where the MRAP had crashed was more complex than initial reports had indicated, with multiple branches and numerous caves that could provide concealment for a skilled survivor. "Morrison," she'd said, pointing to a section of the map that showed a series of interconnected valleys, "look at this terrain. If someone survived that crash and had the training to evade capture, they wouldn't stay near the wreckage. They'd move deeper into the ravine system where they could find water and concealment." Morrison had nodded reluctantly, though Chun could see the doubt in his expression. She'd grown accustomed to that look over the years, the way male colleagues questioned her judgment, not because of her performance, but because of their preconceptions about women in combat roles. Chun's path to becoming a combat pilot had been marked by the same kind of institutional resistance that Elena had faced as a combat medic. The daughter of Taiwanese immigrants, she'd grown up in a household where academic achievement was expected, and military service was seen as a noble calling. Her father had been a helicopter mechanic in the Republic of China Air Force, and some of Chun's earliest memories involved watching aircraft take off and land at the base where he worked. When Chun had announced her intention to become a military pilot, her parents had been supportive but realistic about the challenges she would face. "Sarah," her mother had said, "you will have to be twice as good as the men around you to be considered half as competent. Are you prepared for that?" Chun had been prepared, though she hadn't fully understood what that preparation would require. Flight school had been a brutal process of elimination where physical capability, mental acuity, and emotional resilience were tested in ways designed to identify potential weaknesses. Chun had excelled at the technical aspects of aviation, but she'd struggled with the cultural barriers that made some of her instructors question whether women belonged in combat aircraft. Her breakthrough had come during a training exercise that simulated a combat search and rescue mission in hostile territory. Chun had been tasked with extracting a downed pilot from a heavily defended area while under simulated enemy fire. The exercise was designed to test decision-making under extreme stress, and most students required multiple attempts to complete. If successfully, Chun had completed the mission on her first try, demonstrating a combination of technical skill and tactical awareness that impressed even her most skeptical instructors. More importantly, she'd shown an intuitive understanding of how to balance risk against potential reward, a quality that was essential for search and rescue operations in combat zones. Chun, her instructor, a combat veteran named Major Williams, had said after the exercise, "That was exceptional work. You've got the instincts for this kind of flying. But you need to understand that search and rescue in combat isn't just about flying skills. You're going to be making life and death decisions for people you've never met, often with incomplete information and under intense pressure." Chun had nodded, though she wouldn't fully understand what he meant until she was flying real missions in Afghanistan, racing against time to reach wounded soldiers before they bled out or were captured by enemy forces. Her first deployment had been to Bagram Airfield, where she'd been assigned to the 66th Rescue Squadron. The unit had a reputation for conducting the most dangerous search and rescue missions in the theater, often flying into areas that other aircraft avoided. Chun had been eager to prove herself, but she'd quickly learned that combat search and rescue required a different kind of courage than she'd developed during training. The first time Chun had flown into active combat to extract casualties, she'd been surprised by the intensity of her emotional response. The wounded soldiers she'd helped load into her aircraft weren't training mannequins or simulation casualties. They were real people with real families, who were counting on her to bring them home safely. "Ma'am," one of the wounded soldiers had said as Chun's crew chief worked to stabilize him during the flight to the field hospital, "Thank you for coming to get us. I didn't think anyone was going to make it in time." Chun had smiled and squeezed his hand, though she was fighting back tears behind her helmet visor. The responsibility of being someone's last hope for survival was something she'd never experienced before, and it had changed her understanding of what it meant to be a military pilot. Over the following months, Chun had developed a reputation for being willing to attempt rescues that other pilots considered too dangerous. She'd extracted casualties from landing zones that were under active enemy fire, navigated through mountain terrain and weather that should have grounded aircraft, and landed in areas where the margin for error was measured in inches rather than feet. Her success rate had been remarkable, but Chun understood that statistics didn't capture the full story of what search and rescue operations meant for the people involved. Every successful mission represented someone's child, spouse, or parent who would make it home alive. Every failed mission was a family that would receive a folded flag instead of a reunion, the mission that had brought Chun to the ravine where Alina was hiding had begun like dozens of others, a routine search for remains that was expected to yield nothing more than closure for grieving families. But Chun had learned to trust her instincts, and something about this particular search felt different. She'd been flying a systematic search pattern over the ravine system when her crew chief, Technical Sergeant Rodriguez, had spotted something unusual. "Ma'am, I'm seeing what looks like a signal mirror about 2 clicks south of the crash site. It's coming from that cluster of boulders near the stream." Chun had banked the helicopter toward the location, her heart racing with the possibility that they'd found a survivor. Signal mirrors were standard equipment for personnel trained in survival and evasion, and the fact that someone was using one suggested they were not only alive but thinking tactically about rescue procedures. As they approached the signal location, Chun had been struck by how well concealed the position was. The boulders provided excellent cover from ground observation, and the nearby stream would supply fresh water for an extended period. Whoever had chosen this location understood fieldcraft and survival techniques. "I don't see anyone," Morrison had said, scanning the area with binoculars. "Could be the Taliban trying to lure us into an ambush." Chun had considered the possibility, but the signal pattern was too consistent with military training to be coincidental. Someone with American military survival training was down there, and they were trying to communicate with aircraft without revealing their position to enemy forces in the area. She'd made the decision to attempt contact using standard survival radio procedures. "Survivor, this is Guardian Angel on guard frequency. If you can hear this transmission, key your radio twice." The response had been immediate, 2 distinct clicks on the emergency frequency that confirmed they were in contact with a trained American service member. Chun had felt a surge of adrenaline as she realized they'd found someone who was supposed to be dead. "Guardian Angel, this is Bravo 26 Medical," came the faint voice over the radio. "I'm Staff Sergeant Vasquez, the medic from the convoy that was hit 3 days ago. I'm injured but mobile, and I need immediate extraction." Chun had exchanged glances with Morrison, both of them recognizing the significance of what they were hearing. According to official reports, Staff Sergeant Vasquez had been killed in action along with the rest of her convoy. The fact that she was not only alive but had managed to evade capture for 3 days suggested exceptional survival skills and tactical awareness. "Bravo 26 Medical, Guardian Angel. What's your physical condition? Can you move to an extraction point?" Elena's voice had been steady despite the obvious pain she was experiencing. "I have a broken left leg and possible fractures in my right ankle. I can move, but it's going to be slow. I've been monitoring Taliban radio traffic, and there are still enemy forces in the area." Chun had been impressed by Elena's tactical awareness. The fact that she'd been monitoring enemy communications while managing significant injury showed the kind of professional competence that Chun had learned to recognize in exceptional soldiers. "Copy that, Bravo 26 Medical. We're going to need you to move to a landing zone that can accommodate our aircraft. Can you make it to the open area about 200 meters east of your current position?" The silence that followed had been long enough to make Chun wonder if they'd lost radio contact. When Elena finally responded, her voice carried the weight of someone who is calculating the odds of survival against the certainty of continued suffering. "Guardian Angel, I can make it to the LZ, but I need you to understand something. I've been watching the Taliban search patterns, and they're conducting regular sweeps of this area. If we're going to do this, we need to do it fast, and we need to do it right. I won't be responsible for getting your crew killed trying to save me." Chun had smiled at Alana's response, recognizing the kind of selfless professionalism that marked the best soldiers. Even wounded and stranded behind enemy lines, Elena was thinking about the safety of the people who were trying to rescue her. "Bravo 26 Medical, that's not your call to make. We're coming to get you, and we're going to bring you home." Start moving toward the LZ and will provide overwatch during your movement. What followed was 20 minutes of the most intense flying Chun had ever experienced. She'd had to position her helicopter to provide security for Elena's movement while staying high, enough to avoid ground fire and mobile enough to respond to threats. Meanwhile, Elena had dragged herself across 200 meters of rocky terrain with 2 broken legs, stopping frequently to hide from Taliban patrols that were searching for the source of the helicopter activity. Chun had watched Elena's progress through her aircraft's optics, and she'd been amazed by the medic's tactical awareness and determination. Despite her injuries, Elena had moved with the deliberate care of someone who understood fieldcraft and knew how to avoid detection. When Elena finally reached the landing zone, Chun had been shocked by her appearance. The medic was clearly in significant pain, her improvised splints and bandages showing the extent of her injuries. But her eyes were alert and focused, and she'd managed to maintain her equipment and weapons despite 3 days of hiding in hostile territory. Guardian Angel, Bravo 26 Medical is in position for extraction. I've got movement to the north that might be enemy forces. Recommend you get in here fast. Chun had brought her helicopter into the landing zone with the kind of precision that came from years of practicing dangerous extractions. Elena had crawled to the aircraft and pulled herself aboard with help from the crew chief, her face pale with pain but her demeanor calm and professional. "Ma'am," Elena had said as Chun's medical team began treating her injuries, "thank you for not giving up on me. I wasn't sure anyone was going to come looking." Chun had turned to look at the wounded medic, seeing in Elena's eyes the same determination that had driven her own career. "We never leave anyone behind, Sergeant. That's not how we operate." As they'd flown toward the field hospital, Chun had reflected on what separated exceptional soldiers from ordinary ones. It wasn't just training or physical capability, it was the refusal to accept defeat even when the odds were overwhelming. Elena had shown that quality during her 3 days of survival, and Chun recognized it because she'd cultivated the same characteristic in herself. The rescue had been successful. But Chun understood that Elena's real test was just beginning. Surviving the initial ambush and evading capture had been impressive, but the medic's injuries were severe enough that her military career might be over. The question was whether Elena would accept that limitation or find a way to overcome it. Just as she'd overcome every other obstacle in her path, the doctors at Landstuhl Regional Medical Center had given Elena a prognosis that sounded like a death sentence for her military career. Dr. Margaret Hoffman, the orthopedic surgeon who'd spent 6 hours reconstructing Elena's shattered left femur, delivered the news with the clinical precision that medical professionals use to distance themselves from emotional outcomes. "Staff Sergeant Vasquez," Dr. Hoffman had said, reviewing the X-rays that showed an impressive array of titanium hardware holding Elena's leg together. "The surgery was successful from a medical standpoint. We've stabilized the fractures and restored structural integrity to the bone. However, the extent of the damage means you'll likely experience permanent mobility limitations." Elena had stared at the ceiling tiles, counting the perforations in the acoustic panels while processing what she was hearing. Permanent mobility limitations was medical terminology for your combat career is over. The leg that had carried her 200 meters across rocky terrain to reach the extraction point would never again be strong enough to meet military physical fitness standards. "What kind of limitations?" Elena had asked, though she already knew the answer would destroy everything she'd worked for. Dr. Hoffman had consulted her notes with the careful attention of someone who understood that her words would fundamentally alter a patient's future. "You'll regain most of your mobility with extensive physical therapy, but running, jumping, and carrying heavy loads will likely cause significant pain and potential re-injury. The hardware we've installed will set off metal detectors for the rest of your life, and you'll need follow-up surgeries every few years to maintain functionality." Elena had nodded, maintaining the stoic expression she'd perfected during her years of military service. But inside, she felt something fundamental break that had nothing to do with bones or surgical hardware. The identity she'd spent years building was being stripped away by medical reality, leaving her to figure out who she was when she wasn't a soldier. The physical therapy had been more brutal than combat. Elena had endured months of exercises designed to restore function to muscles that had atrophied during her recovery, working with specialists who pushed her through pain that made her injuries seem trivial by comparison. Every session was a reminder of what she'd lost and what she'd never regain. Her physical therapist, Captain David Kim, had been a former infantry officer who'd lost his left arm to an IED explosion during his own deployment. Kim understood the psychological aspects of recovery that purely medical professionals sometimes missed, and he'd developed a reputation for helping wounded soldiers transition from military to civilian life. "Vasquez," Kim had said during one particularly difficult session, "you're fighting the wrong battle. You're trying to get back to where you were before your injuries, but that person doesn't exist anymore. The question is who you want to become with the capabilities you have now." Elena had appreciated the advice, but she'd struggled to accept the reality of her situation. For years, her identity had been built around being a combat medic, someone who could perform under pressure and save lives in dangerous situations. Without that role, she felt like she was drifting without purpose or direction. The Army's Medical Evaluation Board had been a bureaucratic process that felt like a trial where the verdict was predetermined. Elena had sat in a conference room while officers reviewed her medical records and discussed her future as if she weren't present. The conclusion had been inevitable. She would be medically retired with disability benefits that would provide financial security but couldn't replace the sense of purpose she'd lost. "Staff Sergeant Vasquez," the board president had said, "your service record is exemplary, and your actions during the convoy ambush demonstrate exceptional courage under fire. However, your injuries prevent you from meeting the physical demands of military service. We're recommending medical retirement with full benefits." Elena had accepted the decision with the same professionalism she'd brought to every aspect of her military career, but the finality of it felt like being pronounced dead while still breathing. She'd spent months preparing for a future that would never exist, and now she had to figure out how to build a new life from the pieces that remained. The transition to civilian life had been more challenging than Elena had expected. The structure and sense of purpose that had defined her military experience were absent from the civilian world, leaving her feeling lost and disconnected from the life she was supposed to be building. She'd moved back to El Paso to be closer to her family, but the city felt foreign after years of military bases and deployment rotations. Elena had tried various civilian jobs, from emergency room technician to pharmaceutical sales representative, but nothing provided the sense of meaningful work that had motivated her military service. She'd grown restless and frustrated, feeling like she was wasting skills and experience that could make a difference in the world. Her breakthrough had come during a conversation with her father at a family barbecue 6 months after her medical retirement. Elena had been describing her latest job interview, trying to sound enthusiastic about a position that felt like settling for less than what she was capable of achieving. "Mia," her father had said, setting down his beer and looking at her with the serious expression he reserved for important conversations. "You're talking about these jobs like they're punishments. What do you actually want to do with your life?" Elena had started to give him the standard answer about finding stability and building a career, but the words had felt hollow even as she spoke them. The truth was that she wanted to be back in Afghanistan, treating wounded soldiers and making life and death decisions that mattered. But that life was close to her now. "I want to save lives," she'd said finally, the honesty of the statement surprising even her. "I want to do work that matters, where my skills can make a real difference. I want to feel like I'm contributing something important to the world." Her father had smiled, the expression carrying the warmth and understanding that had made him her anchor throughout her childhood. Then why are you looking for jobs that don't let you do that? The question had stayed with Elena for weeks, forcing her to reconsider her assumptions about what was possible with her current limitations. She'd begun researching programs that might allow her to use her medical training in civilian settings, looking for opportunities that would provide the sense of purpose she'd lost. Her research had led her to discover the Tactical Combat Casualty Care Program, a training initiative designed to teach civilian first responders the combat medical techniques that had proven so effective in military settings. The program was relatively new, but early results suggested that applying military medical protocols to civilian emergencies could significantly improve survival rates. Elena had contacted the program director, Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, who'd been intrigued by Elena's combination of combat medical experience and proven ability to perform under extreme stress. During their phone conversation, Dr. Rodriguez had described the program's mission in terms that resonated with Elena's desire to continue serving. We're looking for instructors who can teach these techniques not just as medical procedures, but as combat skills, Dr. Rodriguez had explained. Civilian first responders face many of the same challenges as military medics: limited resources, dangerous environments, and the need to make quick decisions under pressure. Your experience could help us save lives in ways that traditional medical training doesn't address. Elena had been skeptical at first, wondering whether her physical limitations would prevent her from being effective as an instructor. But as she'd learned more about the program, she'd realized that her value wasn't in demonstrating physical techniques, but in sharing the tactical and psychological knowledge that had made her effective as a combat medic. Her first training session had been with a group of paramedics from a high-crime urban area who'd been experiencing difficulty treating gunshot victims in hostile environments. Elena had been nervous about her ability to connect with civilian personnel who might not understand military culture or appreciate the relevance of combat medical techniques. I know some of you are wondering why you're getting medical training from a soldier, Elena had said, addressing the group of paramedics who'd been studying her with expressions ranging from skepticism to curiosity. The answer is simple. The techniques we developed in combat can save lives in civilian settings because the challenges are often the same: limited time, dangerous environments, and the need to make decisions when someone's life hangs in the balance. Elena had spent the next 8 hours teaching the paramedics how to apply tourniquets under pressure, how to treat penetrating wounds in moving vehicles, and how to prioritize multiple casualties when resources were limited. But more importantly, she'd taught them the psychological techniques that allowed combat medics to function effectively under extreme stress. The difference between a good medic and a great medic isn't technical skill, Elena had explained during a break in the training. It's the ability to stay calm when everyone around you is panicking, to make decisions based on evidence rather than emotion, and to accept that you can't save everyone, but you never stop trying. The response from the paramedics had been overwhelmingly positive. They'd appreciated not just the medical techniques, but the tactical mindset that Elena brought to emergency medicine. Several had told her that the training had changed their approach to difficult calls, giving them confidence to work in situations they'd previously found overwhelming. Word of Elena's effectiveness as an instructor had spread quickly through the emergency medical community. She'd been invited to train police officers, firefighters, and emergency room personnel in techniques that bridge the gap between military and civilian medicine. Each training session had reinforced her sense that she'd found a way to continue serving despite her physical limitations. Subscribe now and become part of our amazing community. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video. The program had grown rapidly, and Elena had been promoted to lead instructor within 6 months of joining the organization. She developed curricula for different types of first responders, created assessment protocols to measure training effectiveness, and established partnerships with military medical units to ensure that the latest combat medical innovations were incorporated into civilian training. Elena had also begun working with wounded veterans who were struggling with their own transitions to civilian life. She developed a mentorship program that connected recently injured service members with veterans who'd successfully navigated similar challenges. The program had been remarkably successful, with participation rates and satisfaction scores that exceeded expectations. Elena, Dr. Rodriguez had said during their quarterly review meeting, "You've transformed this program from a good idea into something that's actually saving lives. The feedback we're getting from departments that have implemented your training is remarkable. They're reporting improved survival rates and better outcomes for trauma patients." Elena had felt a satisfaction that reminded her of the feeling she'd experienced when saving wounded soldiers in Afghanistan. She wasn't treating patients directly anymore, but she was multiplying her impact by teaching others to be more effective in life and death situations. Her work had caught the attention of federal agencies that were looking for ways to improve emergency response capabilities. Elena had been invited to consult on training programs for FBI tactical teams, agents, and Border Patrol officers who worked in high-risk environments, where combat medical skills could make the difference between life and death. The consulting work had led to opportunities that Elena had never imagined during her military service. She'd been asked to develop training protocols for international peacekeeping forces, to advise foreign militaries on combat medical procedures, and to contribute to research on trauma care that was being conducted at major medical centers. Each new opportunity had reinforced Elena's understanding that her value wasn't limited by her physical capabilities. The knowledge and experience she'd gained as a combat medic were assets that could be applied in numerous ways, creating impact that went far beyond what she'd been able to achieve as an individual soldier. Elena had also begun speaking at conferences and medical schools, sharing her experiences and advocating for the integration of military medical techniques into civilian trauma care. Her presentations had been well received, and she'd developed a reputation as an expert who could communicate complex medical concepts in ways that resonated with diverse audiences. During one particularly memorable presentation at a major medical conference, Elena had been approached by Dr. Sarah Chun, a trauma surgeon who'd been researching the application of military medical techniques to civilian emergencies. Dr. Chun had been impressed by Elena's presentation and had invited her to collaborate on a research project. "Elena," Dr. Chun had said, "your experience represents exactly the kind of practical knowledge that academic medicine needs. Would you be interested in helping us develop evidence-based protocols for implementing combat medical techniques in civilian settings?" Elena had accepted the invitation, beginning a collaboration that would eventually lead to published research and changes in how trauma care was delivered in emergency departments across the country. The work had been challenging but rewarding, allowing her to contribute to medical knowledge in ways that would benefit countless patients. As Elena reflected on her journey from wounded soldier to civilian instructor and researcher, she realized that her injuries had forced her to discover capabilities she'd never known she possessed. The combat medic who'd crawled 200 meters with broken legs to reach an extraction point had become someone who could influence emergency medical care on a national level. The transition hadn't been easy, and there were still days when Elena missed the immediacy and intensity of combat medicine. But she'd found a way to continue serving, to continue making a difference, and to continue growing as both a professional and a person. The limitations that had seemed like the end of her story had actually been the beginning of something new, and potentially more impactful than anything she'd done in uniform. The phone call that changed everything came at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, jolting Elena from the restless sleep that had plagued her since returning from Afghanistan. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar number with a Washington, D.C. area code. And Elena's military-trained instincts immediately recognized the significance of receiving an urgent call from the nation's capital. "Staff Sergeant Vasquez," she answered, automatically reverting to her military bearing despite being officially retired for over a year. "Elena, this is Colonel Martinez from the Pentagon's Office of Special Operations. We have a situation that requires your immediate attention." "How quickly can you get to Andrews Air Force Base?" Elena sat up in bed, her mind racing through the implications of what she was hearing. The Pentagon didn't make middle-of-the-night calls to retired soldiers unless something had gone catastrophically wrong. "Sir, I'm not on active duty anymore. I was medically retired following my injuries in Afghanistan. I'm aware of your status. Elena, I'm also aware that you've spent the last year developing training programs that have revolutionized how we think about combat medicine. Right now we have American hostages in a situation where your expertise could mean the difference between life and death." The urgency in Colonel Martinez's voice was unmistakable, and Elena felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that had once preceded combat missions. Despite her injuries and civilian status, she was still a soldier at heart, and American lives were at stake. "What kind of situation?" Elena asked, already mentally preparing for whatever she was about to hear. 12 American aid workers have been taken hostage by a militant group in Somalia. They're being held in a compound that's been converted into a makeshift medical facility. Intelligence suggests that several of the hostages have been injured during the capture, and their captors are demanding that we provide medical supplies and treatment. Elena understood the tactical implications immediately. Hostage situations involving injured captives created complex challenges that standard rescue protocols weren't designed to address. The militants would likely use the injured hostages as human shields, making any rescue attempt extremely dangerous for the very people they were trying to save. "Sir, I appreciate the confidence, but I'm not sure how a retired medic can help with a hostage situation. This sounds like a job for Delta Force or SEAL Team 6. Colonel Martinez's voice carried the weight of someone who'd spent years dealing with impossible situations. "Elena, the rescue team is already being assembled, but they need someone who understands combat medicine, who can advise them on how to treat injured hostages during an active assault, and who can train them to provide medical care in a hostile environment." Elena felt her pulse quicken as she realized what was being asked of her. She wouldn't be participating in the rescue directly. Her injuries made that impossible, but she would be responsible for ensuring that the rescue team could keep injured hostages alive during and after the assault. "How much time do we have?" Elena asked, already moving toward her closet to gather clothes and equipment. 18 hours. The rescue team is assembling at Fort Bragg, and they need to be briefed on medical procedures that can be performed during combat operations. Training programs have prepared civilian first responders for dangerous situations, but this is different. We need someone who can teach special operations soldiers how to be combat medics. Elena arrived at Andrews Air Force Base 3 hours later, her mind already working through the medical challenges that a hostage rescue would present. She'd packed her training materials, medical references, and enough equipment to demonstrate the procedures she'd be teaching. The flight to Fort Bragg gave her time to review intelligence reports and develop a training curriculum that could be compressed into a few intense hours. The Special Operations Compound at Fort Bragg was a hive of activity when Elena arrived. She was met by Major Thompson, the mission commander, who briefed her on the tactical situation while leading her to the training facility where the rescue team was waiting. "Elena, we have 12 operators who are among the best soldiers in the world, but they're not medics. They know basic first aid, but what we're asking them to do goes far beyond that. They need to be able to treat gunshot wounds, stabilize fractures, and manage traumatic injuries while under fire." Elena studied the intelligence photos of the compound where the hostages were being held. The building had been a hospital before. The militants took it over, which meant it contained medical equipment, but also created tactical complications. The militants had positioned themselves to use the injured hostages as human shields, making precise operations essential. "Major, what's the medical condition of the hostages?" Elena asked, noting the layout of the building and the potential locations where injured personnel might be held. 3 of them were shot during the initial capture. Intelligence suggests they're alive but in serious condition. The militants have been providing minimal medical care, probably just enough to keep them alive as bargaining chips. Elena felt the familiar cold anger that had motivated her during her military service. The thought of injured Americans being held captive by people who would use their suffering as leverage was intolerable. She might not be able to participate in the rescue directly, but she could ensure that the rescue team was prepared to save every possible life. The training session that followed was unlike anything Elena had conducted before. The 12 operators were elite soldiers who learned quickly and asked intelligent questions, but they were being asked to master medical skills that typically required months of training. Elena had to distill years of combat medical experience into a few hours of intensive instruction. "Gentlemen," Elena began, addressing the assembled operators, "you're about to attempt something that's never been done before, conducting a hostage rescue while simultaneously providing advanced medical care to injured captives. The techniques I'm going to teach you could mean the difference between bringing everyone home alive and having to explain to families why their loved ones died during the rescue." Elena spent the next 6 hours teaching the operators how to assess and treat traumatic injuries under combat conditions. She demonstrated tourniquet application, wound packing, and airway management using scenarios that replicated the conditions they would face during the actual rescue. More importantly, she taught them to think like combat medics, prioritizing patients based on survivability and available resources. The operators were exceptional students, grasping concepts quickly and asking questions that showed they understood the life and death implications of what they were learning. Elena was particularly impressed by Sergeant First Class Rodriguez, a team leader who had previous experience as a Navy corpsman and who helped translate Elena's teaching into language. That resonated with the other operators. "Doc," Rodriguez said during a break in the training, "this is exactly what we needed. We're comfortable with the tactical aspects of the mission, but knowing how to keep people alive while we're fighting our way out gives us options we didn't have before." Elena had also worked with the team's intelligence officer to develop medical profiles of the hostages based on the limited information available. She'd created treatment protocols for different injury scenarios and established priorities for medical evacuation that would ensure the most critically injured hostages received immediate attention. The final phase of the training focused on the psychological aspects of providing medical care during combat operations. Elena taught the operators how to remain calm while treating injured people, how to make rapid decisions about patient prioritization, and how to communicate effectively with injured hostages who might be confused or frightened. "The hardest part isn't the medical procedures," Elena explained. "It's maintaining your composure when you're trying to save someone's life while people are shooting at you. The hostages are going to be scared and possibly in shock. Your calm professionalism could be as important as your medical skills in keeping them alive." As the training concluded, Elena felt a familiar sense of satisfaction mixed with anxiety. She'd done everything possible to prepare the rescue team, but the ultimate success of the mission would depend on their ability to execute under pressure. The thought of 12 Americans whose lives hung in the balance made her wish she could be there to help directly. "Major," Thompson approached Elena as the operators were conducting final equipment checks. "Elena, what you've done here today is remarkable. These men are going into an impossible situation, but you've given them the tools they need to save lives. That's going to make all the difference." Elena watched the operators board their transport aircraft, each one carrying medical supplies and knowledge that could prove crucial in the hours ahead. She felt a connection to these soldiers that transcended her civilian status. They were going into harm's way to save American lives, and she'd played a role in preparing them for that mission. The waiting that followed was excruciating. Elena remained at Fort Bragg, monitoring communications and standing by in case the rescue team needed additional medical guidance. The mission was scheduled to begin at dawn Somalia time, which meant Elena would spend the night knowing that 12 American lives depended on training she'd compressed into a few intense hours. The first reports from the rescue team came 18 hours after they'd departed. The assault had been successful, with all 12 hostages rescued alive. 3 of the hostages had required immediate medical attention, but the operators had been able to stabilize them using the techniques Elena had taught them. Everyone was coming home. Elena felt tears streaming down her face as she listened to the mission reports. The training she'd developed, the experience she'd gained during her own deployment, and the knowledge she'd accumulated during her recovery had all contributed to saving American lives. She might not have been able to participate in the rescue directly, but she'd played a crucial role in its success. The aftermath of the mission brought recognition that Elena had never expected. The Pentagon released a statement crediting her training with the successful rescue of all 12 hostages, and she was invited to brief senior military leaders on the integration of advanced medical training into special operations missions. More importantly, Elena realized that her injuries hadn't ended her military service. They'd transformed it into something different, but equally valuable. The combat medic who'd once treated wounded soldiers in Afghanistan had become someone who could prepare others to save lives in situations she'd never imagined. The phone call that had interrupted her sleep had led to a mission that proved her worth extended far beyond her physical limitations. Elena had found a way to continue serving, to continue making a difference, and to continue being the soldier she'd always been in her heart. The mission briefing room at Fort Bragg felt different this time. Elena sat at the head of a conference table surrounded by officials whose rank insignia and agency credentials represented the highest levels of American military and intelligence leadership. The successful hostage rescue in Somalia had elevated her from a retired soldier, consulting on training programs, to someone whose expertise was considered essential for the most sensitive operations. General Patricia Hayes, the commanding officer of Joint Special Operations Command, opened the briefing with an intensity that made Elena's previous Pentagon meetings seem routine. Elena, what I'm about to tell you is classified at the highest levels. 3 days ago, we lost contact with a 12-person medical team that was providing humanitarian aid in a remote region of Syria. Satellite imagery suggests they're being held in a compound that's heavily fortified and defended by well-armed militants. Elena studied the aerial photographs spread across the table, automatically analyzing the tactical challenges they presented. The compound was larger and more complex than the Somalia facility, with multiple buildings connected by underground tunnels. The militants appeared to have significant resources and military training, making any rescue attempt extraordinarily dangerous. What makes this situation different from Somalia? Elena asked, noting the defensive positions and weapon emplacements visible in the imagery. Colonel Martinez, who'd been coordinating with Elena since the initial hostage crisis, leaned forward with an expression that conveyed the gravity of what they were facing. Intelligence indicates that at least half of the medical team has been injured, some critically. The militants are using the compound's medical facilities to keep the hostages alive, but they're also using their injuries as psychological warfare against the other captives. Elena felt her professional detachment waver as she processed the implications. The militants weren't just holding hostages, they were deliberately maintaining their suffering as a tool of intimidation. The combination of medical need and psychological torture created challenges that went far beyond standard rescue protocols. The rescue team will need to be prepared for casualties that have been deliberately neglected, Elena said, her voice, carrying the controlled anger that had motivated her throughout her military career. We're talking about infected wounds, untreated fractures, and possibly victims of torture who will need immediate psychological as well as medical support. General Hayes nodded grimly. That's why we need you on the ground for this mission. The rescue team will be operating in a hostile environment, where every decision could mean the difference between saving lives and losing them. We need someone with your expertise making those decisions in real time. Elena's heart stopped. The general was asking her to participate directly in a combat mission, something her medical retirement had supposedly made impossible. The titanium hardware in her leg would set off metal detectors. Her mobility was permanently compromised, and she hadn't undergone the physical conditioning required for special operations. Ma'am, I appreciate the confidence, but I'm not cleared for combat operations. My injuries have been reviewed by our medical board, General Hayes interrupted. Dr. Rodriguez has certified that while you can't meet standard physical fitness requirements, you're capable of performing the duties of a combat medic in a limited capacity. More importantly, you're the only person who combines the medical expertise we need with the tactical knowledge to operate in this environment. Elena stared at the mission documents, feeling the weight of an opportunity she'd never expected to receive. The military career she'd thought was over was being offered back to her in a form she'd never imagined. She would be returning to combat not as a traditional soldier, but as a medical specialist whose unique combination of skills made her essential to the mission. What exactly would my role be? Elena asked, trying to maintain her professional composure while her mind raced through the implications. Major Thompson, who'd commanded the Somalia rescue team, provided the tactical details. You'd be embedded with the assault team as senior medical officer. Your primary responsibility would be triaging and treating the hostages during and after the rescue. You'd also be responsible for training the operators on advanced medical procedures during our flight to the target. Elena realized that everything she'd experienced since her injuries, the medical training, the rehabilitation, the development of civilian emergency protocols, had been preparation for this moment. Her broken leg had forced her to become something more than a combat medic. She'd become a bridge between military and civilian medicine who could operate in environments that neither traditional soldiers nor civilian doctors could handle. I'll need complete medical supplies and equipment, Elena said, her decision made. If we're going to save everyone, I need to be prepared for every possible injury scenario. The next 18 hours were a blur of preparation that felt like a compressed version of Elena's entire military career. She reviewed intelligence reports, studied building layouts, and developed medical protocols for scenarios ranging from routine injuries to complex surgical procedures that might need to be performed during active combat. The special operations team she'd be working with was larger and more diverse than the Somalia rescue unit. In addition to the standard assault specialists, the team included combat engineers who would breach the compound's defenses, communications specialists who would coordinate with overhead support, and intelligence officers who would gather information about other potential hostages. Elena's medical preparation was more complex than anything she'd undertaken during her active duty service. She had to anticipate not just combat injuries, but also the effects of prolonged captivity, deliberate neglect, and possible torture. Her medical kit included surgical instruments, antibiotics, pain medication, and psychological support materials. The flight to the operational staging area gave Elena time to conduct detailed medical briefings with the assault team, she taught. Then to recognize signs of infection, malnutrition, and psychological trauma that might affect the hostage's ability to cooperate during the rescue. More importantly, she prepared them for the emotional challenges of treating people who'd been deliberately harmed. The hardest part won't be the medical procedures, Elena explained to the assembled operators. It'll be maintaining your focus when you see what's been done to these people. The militants have been using medical neglect as a weapon, and some of what you see is going to make you angry. You need to channel that anger into motivation to save lives, not into revenge. Sergeant First Class Rodriguez, who'd participated in the Somalia mission, helped Elena establish communication protocols that would allow her to coordinate medical care while the assault team secured the compound. They developed hand signals and radio procedures that would work in the chaos of combat operations. "Doc," Rodriguez said during a planning session, "having you on the ground changes everything. In Somalia, we had to make medical decisions based on our limited training. This time, we'll have an expert making those calls. That's going to save lives." Elena felt the familiar pre-mission anxiety that had preceded every combat operation during her deployment. The combination of anticipation and fear was something she'd learned to manage, but returning to combat after more than 2 years of civilian life required mental preparation she hadn't needed as an active duty soldier. The final intelligence briefing revealed details that made Elena's blood run cold. The medical team had been captured while providing aid to Syrian civilians, and the militants had been using their medical expertise to treat wounded fighters while denying care to the hostages. 2 of the American doctors had been forced to perform surgery on militants while their own colleagues lay untreated. This is about more than rescue, Elena realized. These people have been living through hell for weeks. The psychological trauma is going to be as challenging as any physical injuries. The assault began at 03:00 local time, with Elena positioned in the command vehicle that would follow the initial breach team into the compound. She monitored radio communications while making final preparations for the medical challenges ahead, knowing that everything she'd learned about combat medicine would be tested in the most demanding circumstances possible. The compound's defenses were more sophisticated than intelligence had indicated. The militants had prepared for a rescue attempt by creating multiple defensive positions and establishing overlapping fields of fire that made approaching the buildings extremely dangerous. Elena listened to the tactical communications as the assault team fought their way through defenses that were designed to maximize casualties among rescue forces. "Medical, this is Bravo Team," came the urgent radio call that Elena had been anticipating. "We've located the hostages in the basement of the main building. We have multiple casualties who need immediate attention." Elena gathered her medical supplies and moved toward the compound, her injured leg protesting but functioning adequately for the demands of the mission. The sound of gunfire was constant now, with the assault team engaging militants who were fighting desperately to prevent the rescue. The basement where the hostages were held was a scene that challenged even Elena's experienced perspective on human suffering. The 12 members of the medical team were confined in a space that had been designed to maximize their misery while keeping them alive. Several were unconscious, others were clearly in shock, and all showed signs of deliberate neglect. Elena immediately began triaging the casualties, prioritizing those who needed immediate attention while coordinating with the assault team to establish security. The combination of her medical expertise and tactical awareness allowed her to work efficiently in an environment where traditional medical protocols would have been impossible. "We need to get these people out of here now," Elena told the team leader as she worked to stabilize a hostage who was showing signs of severe dehydration. "They're not going to survive much longer under these conditions." The extraction was complicated by the hostage's physical and psychological condition. Several were unable to walk, others were disoriented from their ordeal, and all required immediate medical attention that couldn't wait for evacuation to a hospital. Elena found herself performing emergency medicine in the basement of a building where militants were still fighting to prevent the rescue. Working by flashlight, while explosions echoed through the compound, Elena stabilized fractures, treated infected wounds, and administered medications that she'd never expected to use in combat conditions. Her injured leg was a constant reminder of her own limitations, but her medical training and combat experience allowed her to function effectively despite the chaos. The successful extraction of all 12 hostages was the culmination of everything Elena had learned about combat medicine. She'd proven that her injuries hadn't ended her military usefulness. They'd transformed it into something unique and valuable. The combat medic who'd once treated wounded soldiers had become someone who could save lives in situations that no one else could handle. As the rescue helicopters carried the freed hostages toward safety, Elena realized that her journey from wounded soldier to civilian instructor to combat medical specialist had been preparation for this moment. Every challenge she'd faced, every limitation she'd overcome, had led to a mission where her unique combination of skills had saved American lives in circumstances that would have been impossible for anyone else to handle. The compound erupted in chaos as Elena worked to stabilize the most critically injured hostage. Dr. Sarah Chun, one of the captured medical team members, had been shot in the abdomen 3 days earlier and was showing signs of internal bleeding that required immediate surgical intervention. Elena's makeshift operating area in the basement was illuminated only by tactical flashlights, while automatic weapons fire echoed through the building above. "Rodriguez, I need you to hold this flashlight steady," Elena commanded, her voice calm. Despite the explosions that shook dust from the ceiling, Dr. Chun is bleeding internally and won't survive the helicopter ride without emergency surgery. Rodriguez positioned himself to provide illumination while Elena opened her surgical kit. The titanium hardware in her leg sent sharp pains through her body as she knelt beside the injured doctor, but she forced herself to focus on the delicate work ahead. This was exactly the kind of impossible situation she'd trained for during her years of developing civilian emergency protocols. "Elena," Dr. Chun whispered, her voice barely audible above the sounds of combat, "I don't think I'm going to make it. The bleeding ... it's been getting worse." Elena met the injured doctor's eyes with the steady gaze that had sustained her through countless medical emergencies. "Sarah, I've performed this procedure under fire before. You're going to be fine, but I need you to stay calm and let me work." The surgical procedure Elena was about to attempt would have been challenging in a fully equipped operating room. Performing it in a basement under combat conditions with improvised lighting and limited supplies required the kind of medical expertise that few practitioners possessed. Elena had to rely on her tactile skills and years of experience to navigate anatomy she couldn't clearly see. Working with instruments that had never been designed for major surgery, Elena opened Dr. Chun's abdomen and located the source of the bleeding. A fragment from the initial gunshot had lacerated her spleen, causing the slow internal hemorrhage that was threatening her life. Elena had to perform a partial splenectomy using battlefield techniques she'd learned during her deployment. "Medical. This is Alpha Team," came the urgent radio transmission. "We've secured the upper levels, but we're taking heavy fire from the tunnel system. How much longer do you need?" Elena's hands never stopped moving as she responded to the tactical update. 5 more minutes. I'm performing emergency surgery on a critical patient. She won't survive transport without this procedure." The sound of approaching footsteps in the basement corridor made Rodriguez raise his weapon while maintaining his position as Elena's surgical assistant. The militant who appeared in the doorway was wounded and desperate, his AK-47 pointed directly at Elena as she worked over Dr. Chin's exposed abdomen. "Step away from the woman," the militant demanded in accented English, his weapon trained on Elena's head. "You will not take our prisoners." Elena continued her surgical work without looking up, her hand steady despite the weapon pointed at her skull. Years of combat medicine had taught her that stopping in the middle of a critical procedure was equivalent to murder, regardless of the personal risk involved. "Rodriguez, take him," Elena said calmly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd made life and death decisions under pressure for years. Rodriguez's response was immediate and decisive. 2 suppressed shots eliminated the threat without disrupting Elena's surgical field. The militant's body crumpled to the floor while Elena continued suturing. Dr. Chun's spleen with the focused concentration of someone who understood that hesitation meant death. "Bleeding's controlled," Elena announced as she began closing the surgical incision. "She's stable for transport, but she needs to get to a trauma center within the hour." The extraction from the basement required careful coordination between Elena's medical priorities and the assault team's tactical necessities. Dr. Chun couldn't be moved roughly. But the compound was still contested territory where remaining stationary meant accepting unacceptable risk. Elena had developed a transport protocol that protected Dr. Chun's surgical site while allowing the assault team to move quickly through the compound's dangerous corridors. Rodriguez and another operator carried the stretcher while Elena monitored her patient's vital signs and adjusted her medical care based on the physical demands of the evacuation. The helicopter landing zone was a courtyard that had been cleared of militants but remained exposed to potential sniper fire from surrounding buildings. Elena had to make a crucial decision about Dr. Chun's care while under potential enemy observation. The injured doctor needed additional fluid resuscitation, but the procedure would require several minutes of stationary medical work. "I need 3 minutes to get N4 established," Elena told the helicopter crew chief. "She's lost too much blood to survive the flight without fluid replacement." The crew chief nodded grimly, understanding that Elena's medical judgment was the difference between bringing Dr. Chun home alive or in a body bag. The helicopter's defensive systems provided some protection, but the landing zone remained vulnerable to enemy fire. Elena worked with practiced efficiency, while the helicopter's engines provided cover noise for her medical procedures. The 4 catheter slid into Dr. Chun's vein on the first attempt, and Elena began administering the fluid replacement that would sustain her patient during the flight to the trauma center. "You saved my life," Dr. Chun whispered as Elena secured the IV line and prepared her for transport. "The surgery. I felt you working. You never hesitated, even when that man had a gun to your head." Elena helped load Dr. Chun into the helicopter, while coordinating with the flight medic who would continue her care during transport. The successful surgery had been the culmination of everything Elena had learned about combat medicine, but it had also proven that her injuries hadn't limited her effectiveness. They'd forced her to develop capabilities that exceeded her previous abilities. The flight back to the stage-in area gave Elena time to reflect on what she'd accomplished. The mission had required her to function as a trauma surgeon, combat medic, and tactical advisor simultaneously. More importantly, it had proven that her value to the military extended far beyond traditional definitions. All 12 hostages had been successfully rescued, with Dr. Chun's emergency surgery being the critical intervention that prevented a casualty during an otherwise perfect mission. Elena's unique combination of medical expertise and tactical experience had made the difference between complete success and tragic loss. The debrief that followed the mission was unlike any Elena had experienced during her military career. General Hayes and other senior officers wanted to understand not just what had happened, but how Elena's approach to combat medicine might be applied to future operations. "Elena," General Hayes said, "what you did in that basement was extraordinary. You performed major surgery under combat conditions, while maintaining tactical awareness and making decisions that saved lives. That's not something we can teach in medical school or even in military training." Elena realized that her journey from wounded soldier to civilian instructor to combat medical specialist had created a unique skill set that the military desperately needed. The integration of advanced medical training with tactical expertise could revolutionize how special operations forces approached complex rescue missions. The mission's success had also validated Elena's understanding of her own capabilities. The injuries that had ended her traditional military career had forced her to develop abilities that made her more valuable than she'd ever been as a conventional soldier. Her broken leg had become a symbol not of limitation, but of transformation. As Elena prepared to return to civilian life, she understood that her service to the military would continue in new and unexpected ways. The combat medic who'd been left for dead in an Afghan ravine had become someone who could save lives in situations that no one else could handle. The phone calls from the Pentagon would continue, bringing new challenges and opportunities to serve. Elena had proven that the definition of military service extended far beyond traditional combat roles, and her story would inspire others to find ways to continue serving despite their own limitations. Elena Vasquez's incredible journey from a wounded soldier left for dead behind enemy lines to becoming one of the military's most valuable medical specialists proves that our greatest limitations can become our greatest strengths. Her 47-day survival in hostile territory, her transformation of combat medicine training, and her return to active operations show us that determination and expertise can overcome any obstacle. What impossible challenge in your own life might actually be preparing you for something greater? Share your thoughts in the comments below about how you've turned setbacks into comebacks. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell for more incredible stories of courage, resilience, and the extraordinary people who refuse to accept defeat. Your support helps us bring you these inspiring tales of human determination that remind us what's possible when we refuse to give up.